Atomic blue. That was the alert level they were still at. How so? Maxis still didn't quite understand why, especially after this sight. Standing upon the USS Yorktown's flight deck, he marveled at the great scars upon her sister's hull. The USS Okinawa, Kaiju Defense Force personnel were still inspecting every inch of her following the attack, their clatter filling the air as Maxis did his best to block it out. The largest of these wounds, a gaping hole torn open in her starboard side. It wasn't that the metal was simply punched in. As amongst the twisted metal, much of it was strangely bent outwards. There were 3 odd protrusions in the hole, much cleaner gashes, being the only places where the metal could be seen twisting into the wreck. Lifting his hand and curving his fingers in, as well as folding his little finger in completely in an attempt to match his hand to the wound. Closing his left eye as he did so, survivors said they saw great claws reaching into the ship. Why had it done that, rather than simply slash the hull open? You know we can get a closer look, right? However, any thoughts on that matter were quickly interrupted by Blake. Maxis lowered his hand and turned to face his counterpart, only for the sun to catch his eye at the wrong angle. Steven said he wanted you to get an up-close look. The 2 of them stood out amongst the rest of the crew, neither dressed in military uniform, but rather more civilian attire, though Blake distinguished himself by carrying a large case on his side, stamped with the KDF logo. I suppose you're right. Looking out across Midway Atoll, the KDF base sprawled across the island. Remote as it was, it had long since become the linchpin on Pacific Kaiju hunting operations. Though the thought of boarding the torn hulk that was the USS Okinawa didn't cause him as much unease as getting there would. Aware of how much he and Blake stuck out, but lacking the other's familiarity from his time at Groom Lake. After a brief stopover at his lab, Max and Blake made their way to the damaged vessel. Blake still shook his head at Max's insistence on retrieving his satchel and its contents, seeing as it just slowed them down and was meaningless weight. But Maxis failed to see the difference in it and what Blake himself carried. Pounding of boots on tarmac, vehicles' engines roaring, and fighters flying overhead. How did they stand all of it? Mercifully, it would quiet as they neared the ship, as if most of the base was actively avoiding it. Survey teams were the only ones brave or foolish enough to entertain the possibility. Despite the ship being cleared of any radiological contamination, the twosome were unsure which they fell into. Soon enough, they'd find themselves in the belly of the Leviathan, feet crunching on dried salt as they walked through the undamaged sections of passageways. Inside, the air tasted of metal and salt, overpoweringly so for the latter. Ahead, the light of the sun shone in through the gash. Checking his Geiger counter, despite being right outside it, or at least what was left of the reactor room, it returned nothing above normal levels. Strange, huh? Chimed in Blake, looking down at his own. Doesn't make any sense. Pushing the limply hanging door open, dented in the locks torn apart from where it had been ripped open on impact. This whole place should have been flooded when the reactor was breached. Kneeling down to get a closer assessment of the room. Ever seen anything like this? As he set down the case he brought, unlatching it. What was left of it wasn't much, only a few meters of floor before it gave way to the void of twisted metal that was left. Grabbing hold of some pipes that still remained fixed to the wall, Maxis took only a half a step at a time, growing more uneasy as he saw what looked like waves of metal, the various decks and wall that had been punched in and then torn out. Shaking his head, not on any of the reports. Feeling where the floor had bent downwards too much to maintain a solid foothold he was comfortable with, he closed his eyes as he moved to take a look at the floors below, heart pounding as he hesitated to open them, only to see the horrific swirl of wave after wave of jagged and deformed steel. The sight was enough to strike terror in him as Maxis stumbled back, shaking his head, trying to get that image out of his mind. So, the reactor core, no trace of it left? turning to see Blake taking out a small set of what looked to him like cameras with rotors attached to them. Nope. Should have warned you, don't get too close to the edge. That's why I brought these. Pulling them up. With how uneven the damage is, it could take weeks to go over it with a fine-toothed comb. But these little guys, rolling up his sleeve, revealing a device on his forearm, a screen that made the two little drones light up and start spinning. They'll be able to get it all, digitize it, and see what our eyes can't, without having to deal with that smell. Two drones' rotors whirring as they took off, projecting an orange grid onto the walls and floor. Maxis had his doubts a computer alone could give them the same perspective as seeing the wreckage up close. But even he had to admit with how chaotic this looked, whether his inexperience alone or it was truly incomprehensible, he struggled to make any sense of it, scratching his head as he looked at the top of the gaping hole. Is it just me, or does that look like a track? Pointing at the large tears in the roof of the hole that led out to the protrusions he saw from the outside. Goes all the way here, pointing the metal from them bending inwards. Cocking his head to one side, Blake traced Maxis' steps as the kaijologist stood aside to give his counterpart the same perspective. Puzzled. Strange, as it was the only part of this damage where all the metal bent in a uniform manner, all pointing to where they stood. You're right. Checking his wrist computer, grumbling lightly. This might take a while. Before turning back to Maxis. Claws. That's just how they looked from the outside, right? Who was presently deep in thought, looking at the ripped walls, snapping him out. Yes, turning to face the weapons engineer. That would be the only thing I can imagine. Massive claws, at least. Shaking his head. I have no idea, actually. Recalling the scattered testimony of the survivors, some said claws, others a massive wave, but nothing concrete. How do you suppose it hit us? Bad luck it got the reactor? Taking a side glance at Maxis, who shook his head. Reaching for his communicator, only to have it ring in his hand. He'd been expecting Stevens. Tapping the blinking white light to answer it. Director only to be abruptly cut off. Not the big man, came the unmistakably more than mildly annoyed sound of Valerie's voice. Where's the book? Clearly picturing her saying that through gritted teeth. Before he could even ask why, she followed up with, Files of pages 831 through 854 got corrupted. I need it. Now. Before hearing an audible and heavy inhale to steady her tone. Her next words softened rather heavily. I can't keep working on the translations if I don't have those. I need the completed record. But he was looking for you. Said they were talking to the guy who saw your kaiju. Waiting outside the main building. Even you can't miss it. That made his eyes widen. Where? And yes, I have it. Blurting out excitedly, grabbing the satchel, even though she wouldn't know that. Think you can wrap up here? To Blake before taking off, not bothering to hear his answer. Just his slight start of a nod of approval was all that Maxis required. Mind racing with every question imaginable, as well as the thought that he needed restraint. While he wanted answers, he also wanted the right ones. Memory was a tricky thing, and he didn't want any possible distortions. Picking up the pace, Maxis grabbed the handle on his satchel. If only the constant slamming of it into his side with that book would stop. True to Valerie's word, the main building was obvious, no doubt helped by both Director Stevens and Fleet Admiral Dylan Weathers standing out in front of it. The duo, once more their contrasting attire to their complexions, Stevens' fair skin and his darker coat alongside the white officer's uniform of the darker-skinned Fleet Admiral. Stevens had his arms crossed, easily visible as his head turned from side to side as if he was scanning the whole of the base. No doubt a hardened expression across his face. All Maxis could hope was that he hadn't kept them waiting too long, especially as the sun climbed higher and he could feel the heat radiating off the tarmac. Not that it bothered him, despite the heavy jacket he wore. The closer he got, the more it confirmed Max's suspicion of his demeanor, only to see it soften once his mentor saw him, and hearing Weathers' deep chuckle as he got close enough. Letting out a sigh of relief as he heard that, but also eager to report what he'd seen. We made some headway in the wreck, but Blake still... shaking his head, reprioritizing what was at hand. Not important You have him inside, and Valerie? She's in there too. Director Stevens... She's in there too. Director Stevens got the door for Weathers and Maxis. Scanning his badge so the door would unlock. But I wanted to warn you, don't get your hopes up. Being practically escorted by the two single highest-ranking members of the KDF should have comforted him. Yet the Kaijologist felt nothing but unease. Valerie, calling for the mythographer as they approached their destination. An action was prompted Max to take off his satchel. Valerie's fanatical interest in the book only grew since she's first gotten those files. If he hadn't taken the satchel off before she got here, he'd half expect her to drag him around until it snapped. And, just as expected, she appeared as quick as a flash once called, with the same hungered glint in her eye. With nothing other than a wordless nod of thanks, she snatched it from his hands before going back to her work. Just trying to call after her defeatedly. Be gentle with it. Not certain if she had even heard him. With Valerie's demands squared away, the fleet admiral pulled out a dossier. Dragovich, Kyle, weapons loading crew on the USS Okinawa, no mental health problems, third generation KDF. Handed the dossier over to Maxis. Well, you get into some friendly boxing matches with the crew, but nothing I can see that'd be a red flag. Gesturing across the hallway from where Valerie came from. Was a bit wound up when we talked to him. Not that I can blame him. Weathers didn't need to finish for Maxis to understand where he was going. Thank you, sir. Opening the dossier, looking over everything briefly before closing it. It wasn't what was in there that mattered to him, at least. The possibility of speaking to a Kaiju eyewitness was too much to pass up. Going for the door, eager to see what he had to say. Opening the door, it led to what resembled an interrogation room. A monitor and table set up, looking into the conference room adjoined. So, Stevens was going to monitor everything that was said. Inside, dressed in the military trappings of the KDF, sat a solitary young man. A mountain of one at that. While he knew Weathers was tall, Max had to guess he stood even taller than him. Something which was confirmed once he stood up. About to stand at attention, only to realize halfway through Maxis was far from the decorated officer he may have been expecting. Kyle, Maxis, Kaijologist, nice to meet you, holding his hand out. Unsure how to actually greet someone like this. The other man's shoulders, which had just a moment ago stood broadly, now seemed to dip, just ever so slightly. So, you're the monster man. Taking Max's hand, his grip stunned Maxis. Had he applied any more force there, he'd have expected once their hands released, it'd have been crushed. Despite that strength, the weapons loader's voice shook a little. Yet he spoke quickly. We were on night patrols, and it just came out of nowhere. We were prepping the fuel pods for the wyverns that were gonna take off. Something just slammed into us. His face twisting. That horrible sound, the twisting, scraping metal. He just started leaning to one side. Everyone else was able to grab onto something. The wyvern fell overboard, but I didn't. Not then anyways. Tracing his fingers across the table, as if they'd helped him recall what happened. After that sound stopped, the Okinawa snapped back, rocking the other way. Every word drenched in weight, his eyes darting from side to side, began slowing down, as did his voice. A bead of cold sweat rolling down the side of his face. I was just trying to keep my balance when it switched. I just stumbled over the side. A sound of what Maxis could only guess was shame creeping into his voice as Kyle swallowed air nervously. How badly Maxis wanted to just close his eyes, picture all of this in his own mind. But he was too enthralled by Kyle's words, his expressions, how one detail could twist his face from terror to rage. However scattered these details were, if the damage to the ship wasn't already a statement of that, it made it clear this wasn't just a trick Kyle's eyes played on him. By the storm. The further he went, the more his expression darkened. We lost a lot of good men. I wasn't the only one they pulled out of the water, but I think I was the only one that saw it. Looking down and burying his forehead in his left hand. I'm not sure I'll ever wash the taste of salt out of my mouth. Shifting back to look at Maxis right in the eyes, his expression turned to confusion. When I was under, I saw this light in shape, kind of hazy, but hard to describe, I can see it, but I can't put it into words. Rubbing his fingers as he tried to piece it all together. That was something Maxis was intimately familiar with. Giving a soft reply, sitting up. Think you could maybe draw it? Discarding the papers out of the dossier to find one with a blank back to hand off. A moment of realization seemed to have struck Kyle, and his expression brightened. That might work, yeah. Looking around for a pencil or anything to use, Maxis got up to give him some time to sort this out. Hearing him grip the pencil so tight he thought it cracked. As he stepped out the door, hearing the tip break as Kyle grumbled something to himself. Looking for either something else to write with or a pencil sharpener. This kind of pure, unfiltered recollections were the sorts of things he could only dream of encountering before. Made his mind buzz with the slightest twinge of envy to behold a kaiju in person. Closing the door behind him and seeing surprised looks on both Weathers and Stephen's faces. "You're right to bring him in," Stephen said. "Seems he was a lot more comfortable around you." Or he could have been remembering more details after you left, putting a hand on his chin. "If I may be so bold, may I request you join us, if he wants to, Admiral Weathers?" Looking back at the door he just walked out of, I think he has a lot more to say, but does not quite realize it. Although he himself realized they hadn't finished speaking. Skepticism painted across Weathers' face, but he nodded. After that, standard operations say at least a week debriefing, but this is anything but a standard operation. Turning to Stevens. "And just like you, he's been sleeping in the lab, so we've got an open spot for him." That statement caused Max's ears to burn slightly from the good-natured jab at his superior. No, not superior. An old friend. Let's hope those are my only work habits, he picked up, before pulling out his communicator. "Mr. Royce, you almost finished there?" Blake's voice crackled through the speaker. "Yes, sir. Data's processing. Salt not making it any easier." Trailing on as Weathers leaned over to whisper, "You might want to check on Kyle." As unbeknownst to them, he'd been finished for some time, only periodically resting his head on his fist again, making minor corrections or boldening lines on his work. Nodding silently, Maxis slipped back into the conference room. Uncertainty in his voice. "This is the best I got. All kind of little fuzzy after they started dropping depth charges." Walking around to where Kyle sat, the sketch, while crude, was without a doubt in his mind better than anything Maxis could have drawn himself, let alone under the conditions Kyle was presented with. Now, I saw this thing upside down, so I had to do my best. What was on the paper looked like a large oval with a long trailing appendage sticking out, and long curved triangles along one side. Smudges from where he'd erased and corrected covered the paper, as were lines made by fragments of scattered graphite being brushed off. "So you said there was some kind of glowing." Curious what he'd meant. "Yeah, right here," pointing the pencil's tip to the curved triangle-like shapes. "These kind of, I guess you'd call banana-looking things, had this weird white color coming off them. But it wasn't all at once. This one glowed," pointing at the first one, right at the base where it linked to the oval. Then it traveled up to the point here, tracing the pencil along the arc before lifting it off at the tip, and moved it to the one right behind it. Then this one, doing the same thing, again and again, going down the row of glowing bananas. And it kept repeating. But when it got down to the end of one, the glow just went out, shaking his head. I didn't see these things themselves, it's just whatever was glowing looked like they'd be. As crude as it was hard to mistake. The shape was familiar. Long tail, curved spines along its back. Could it really be the original one? Maxis thought to himself. Anything else after that? Simply, Kyle shook his head. That's all I saw. Those depth charges blinded me after that. And they fished me out of the water, rubbing his eyes. And as he did so, Max's left hand scooped the paper up to take a closer look at the sketch. No, that was more than enough. If you can, I would like to keep you around. Task Force Odysseus is still hunting it. If you can, we would like to have you. Maxis hardly finished his sentence before Kyle looked back at him, lacking any hint of doubt as he clenched his fist. I'd like to take another crack at that monster, all right? With a nod of his head, Maxis held out his hand, to which they shook again. Being as fired up as he was, the handshake given rattled Max's whole skeleton. Welcome aboard, his voice quivering as the handshake ended. Kyle not realizing his own strength until he heard the distortion in the Kaijologist's voice. You may want to get acquainted with Yorktown. She's a little different than the Okinawa. Pressing a button on his communicator as Kyle made his way out. Valerie, can you spare a minute? I want you to look at something. I need a second opinion. He could hear her clacking away on the keys even through the mic. It was a wonder she didn't burn through keyboards. But the mention of her expertise being needed got her to cease. Terminating the call, he knew she was coming over as Stevens and Weathers traded places with the departing Kyle. So, that's what he saw, the director chimed in. And he said it was glowing. A slight twist of disbelief in his voice. You know any bioluminescent kaiju? Unsure if he was asking himself or Weathers, as Stevens looked from one to the other. Both of them shook their heads. Neither do I. Not that it looks like much to begin with, Weathers looking it over, but nothing appeared on sonar either. That would explain how it got close enough to tear into the hull, came Blake's crackling voice. Closer analysis shows all those random tears, they're not random. Stephen set down the datapad he was working on, displaying a wire-framed mesh of the gash in the hull. Everything other than the top seems to be pointing out, unless it's shorter than this curve. A horseshoe-shaped plane popped out, small points of metal sticking through it. And you were right, those marks on the top, consistent across the whole thing. Looks like some kind of claws reached into the hull. And yet, it was foolish enough not to sink the carrier, Valerie chirped, pushing the door open, Max's satchel in hand. I triple-copied the pages. Unless it's cursed, we shouldn't have any more issues. So, what was it you wanted me to look at? Her mention of curses unnerved Maxis. When he read that book, he always had an unsettling feeling, even when he touched those pages. He didn't quite know what they said, but they always felt off. This, handing her the sketch. Her eyes perked up at it, which sparked his interest. I can see why, but it's too vague to be of any use. Many myths of sea monsters with spiked backs are out there, and there's just as many land creatures that swim. Myths? You can't be serious, can you? Legends are what people use just to tell stories. Kaiju only starting appeared after the nuclear test in the Pacific. They're random mutant aberrations. Humanity does have a tendency to over-exaggerate what we see. Giant octopus or squid becomes the kraken, dinosaur fossils become bones of dragons. And even then, folklore has its gaps. First kaiju to appear, the Tokyo tragedy of '56, Radiological contamination was everywhere. Stevens attempted to interject, looking at Maxis with an expectant side-eye. Puzzled, Stevens had always been the one to teach Maxis not to be so close-minded. Was this some sort of test? Opening his mouth to speak, only for Valerie to beat him to the punch. And yet, you consistently allow the naming of Kaiju to follow these creatures of legend. Hesitantly adding to her point, as well as they have appeared in places with no radiological contamination. Looking to see Stevens' reaction, though he gave none. Regardless, Wither's voice echoed sternly. We're not going to figure it out today, let alone by arguing. When we're back on the Yorktown by 2100, every minute we're still docked is another minute we don't have a fleet in the Pacific. While he was stern, his tone wasn't lecturing. If anything, there was a certain gentleness to it. Whispering to Stevens, and that includes us. Thinking what all their words meant, Maxis followed, still having some questions for Stevens, privately. Folding the sketch carefully and taking it into his satchel, which Valley had forgotten to clasp the flap shut, Sir, running after them. That was a test, right? I have no idea what you're talking about, the director replied, furrowing his brow and narrowing his eyes. Maxis couldn't accept that, putting his mouth against his fist as he thought, why bring up the radiation when Stevens had told him, and Maxis had studied accounts of non-irradiated kaiju, and specifically teaching him on classical mythologies and how kaiju shared similarities with those creatures. The fear he'd seen with Kyle, the lack of radiation on the USS Okinawa, how the KDF had been overplaying and overstating its effectiveness for public support. Pieces locking together, or at the very least, starting to come together in his mind. All he could mutter was, because they wanted to forget the fear. That made Stevens stop in his tracks, and unknown to Maxis, got a slight smile to spread across his lips. Back in his lab on the USS Yorktown, a dimly lit room, scattered across his excuse for a desk, were barely legible to all but Stevens' scrawled ramblings Maxis himself had wrote. A picture, a sketch, and an open book lay among them. That means he knew. He had already figured it out, right? Pacing back and forth, Maxis said to himself, no, that cannot be right. Why would he keep that hidden? Trying to work through the buzz in his brain before turning back to his desk, before bringing his open palm crashing down upon it. No, there has to be something else. Something more. Those hands stung from the impact. He stared at the images. The sketch of the sea monster Kyle drew that attacked the USS Okinawa. The photograph of a large creature, the first and nameless kaiju to attack Japan, blurred both by time and the radiation. And the book, open to a page showing an ancient rendering by the people of the Odaz Islands, one of their legendary creatures. Despite stylistic differences between the blurred photo, Kyle's crude sketch, and the ancient's depiction, all three bore similarities. Certain traits that not all shared, but where one lacked, the other two made up for it. The photograph and the ancient artwork showing a large saurian beast standing upright, with curved spines along its back. A smudge atop its snout in the photo in the same place as the ancients drew a great horn. While the photograph lacked any showing of a tail, the ancients drew it with one, a trait Kyle's sketch shared. And then its hands, 3 clawed with an additional clawed thumb, just as there were 3 notable claw marks on the USS Okinawa's hull, though with the notable lack of a thumb. Could it really be you? Task Force Odysseus finally neared their destination, Tokyo. It was fitting. After the world, no, humanity, learned the monsters that lived alongside them at this very spot, they once more tracked another creature to Japan's shores. Warning sirens for the evacuation could be heard faintly above the waves. The USS Yorktown's flight deck was crawling with activity. A pair of V-31 Albatross transports were preparing for takeoff, with a trio of F-118 Pterosaur fighters being raised from the hangars. Pulling out his dog tags, still unsure why Stevens was so insistent on Maxis wearing them. Slipping them onto his neck and tucking them into his shirt, a task made slightly more difficult by the harness he wore under his jacket. Clipping the carabiner onto one of the straps just so it wouldn't be swinging against his leg as he walked, looking out across that skyline. The sun just hovering over the tops of innumerable skyscrapers, painting everything in a flaming red glow. It was hard to imagine, beneath such a serene landscape, hid the flood of citizens attempting to run from the oncoming storm. Something that only made Maxis more anxious. They were only here because of him, fleeing because of him. Part of him hoped he was wrong, that all his calculations, all his predictions were just that. But another didn't. Shaking his head, having to push such thoughts from his mind. He had a job to do. Inhaling heavily, he picked up the pace to join Director Stevens, watching as Blake and Dr. Honda climbed into their Albatross. Special mats had to be rolled out just so they could take off. The heat from the Albatross's engines were so hot it would melt the flight deck if it were exposed. Having to board through the rear drop ramp as the doors were presently occupied. Slightly puzzling, Albatross were utility transports, yet both were equipped with a set of Gatling guns over their side doors. "You'll need this." The director held out a headset, Maxis noting he had a similar one around his own neck. "And stay next to me." Grabbing onto the metal bar in the interior, when Maxis stepped into it after him, the pilots closed the ramp. Inside was roomier than he expected. 30 troops were able to comfortably be seated, more if they had to stand. Naturally, both he and Stevens would take the front seats, and fasten themselves in shortly. Pulling down his microphone, which Maxis took as a cue to put his on, the large earmuffs felt oversized on his head as he adjusted them, with the sudden dampening of the engine's roar slightly unnerving to him. Stevens had been speaking into the mic, something that Maxis had failed to notice in his fidgeting. Rectifying it, Stevens slipped a switch on the headset without his student being aware, linking him to the rest of them. "You read us?" Catching the tail end of what Stevens had said. "This is Apollo Base. We read you loud and clear." Hearing the electronically distorted but still recognizable voice of Admiral Dylan Weathers. Raiden 6. Next was Blake, who was working on his wrist computer. "The Akutama plant just went out. Another quake hit. Still calculating epicenter." "Raiden 2 checking in." "That's just like old times, isn't it?" Dr. Honda's voice broke through. She and Blake were riding in the other Albatross. Along with them, a massive lead-lined sarcophagus with great spools of steel cabling. A lighter chime in her voice than usual. "Let's get underway. This is Tyrannosaur Leader and..." Looking down to Maxis, who just then realized he'd never gotten a call sign yet. A slight smile on his lips. "And Allo 1, all clear." A name no doubt to the slightest amusement of Dr. Antonov, who remained on the ship. Stevens' left hand came to rest between Maxis and himself, palm up, fingers just slightly curled up. "You heard him. Good luck. Happy hunting." The fleet admiral set them off with those last words. Outside, all crew cleared away from the V-31 Albatross as their engines fully roared to life. The whole craft shook, making Max's muscles tense up, hunching his back and looking at his boots as he clenched and unclenched his fists. Heart pounding as the wheels left the flight deck, only to feel the slightest nudge on his right side that nearly made him jump. But as they ascended, picking up speed, Maxis felt his stomach drop, the tilting engines moving to their flight position. Sudden motion made Max's right hand latch onto Stevens with the force of a vice as he screwed his eyes shut and gritted his teeth. The craft rocked back and forth before steadying, the only comfort to be found feeling Stevens' fingers gently wrapping around his hand. As the shuddering lessened, the Kaijologist opened his eyes. The worst had passed, hadn't it? And he turned to Stevens, gratefully smiling as he let go of his mentor's hand. His own shook as he tried to steady it. That would take some getting used to. Cruising over Tokyo Bay and the rest of the fleet, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the out-hunting submarines all forming a veritable wall of metal bristling with cannons. "Where are we with the evacuation?" Though he sounded hesitant to ask. He was signaling one of the Japanese branch's evacuation units. "We're at 89.3%, sir." But the frequency Japan was hit with kaiju attacks rendered only the most efficient possible systems a bare minimum. Yet Maxis still saw Stevens clench his left hand. Where lines are still operational despite tremors, everything else began to blur, all the sound draining together into an unintelligible cacophony to Maxis. Was this what a normal evacuation was? Was this what a normal kaiju attack was like? So many moving parts. By now Maxis was certain they were over Tokyo, knowing below them people scurried like ants from this height. To coordinate the military response, directing troops, formations. And then there was their task. Lake Akutama nuclear power plant's reactor cores. That was the bait. Nuclear accident sites along the ocean floor had been drained dry. The anomalous sea quakes and now the tremors that moved onto land, all pointing in one direction. Outside their escorting jets, 3 F-118 pterosaurs pulled alongside them, one in front and the other 2 behind. If the kaiju were to show up, Maxis doubted their contribution would even matter. "Tremors are getting stronger," one of the teams said over the radio. "Reactors are still holding, but some of the tunnels are becoming unstable, and Reactor 3 still has its core. If the core becomes unstable, then we may need to consider," Honda began before Stevens regretfully cut in. "We are not abandoning the reactor core," drawing that line firmly. The Albatross shuddered as he finished. "We're here anyways." As their descent began, Maxis felt a weight to the air, as if some presence clinging to it. Maybe it was just nerves, he told himself, the pit in his stomach helping to distract him from the weightless feeling that only ceased when they touched ground. The instant they landed, everyone sprang into action, the ramp dropping, and soldiers with them grabbing their gear, weapons raised, everything from rifles, hilariously undersized for the task at hand, to shoulder-fired rockets. They offered some comfort, he supposed, before disembarking with them. "Honda, how good the last cores? Blake, start loading them." Director Stevens' eyes scanning the horizon. As both Stevens and Maxis left the Albatross, and his feet touched true ground for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, it immediately and violently began to shake. Subsiding a few seconds later, it was not without parting scars. Cracks formed on the cooling towers, as everyone other than Maxis struggled to find footing, though he did have to fight for his balance. The landing pad they stood on began to stretch and strain, fissures forming sporadically, but all pointing in the same direction. "Stevens!" Maxis tried to call him over, only to turn around and to see he was already engaged with the commanding officer stationed there. A row of tanks, mobile launch platforms, and foot soldiers of the Japanese branch of the KDF, armed with their respective kit, poised for a fight. At the other Albatross, the cores from the already disabled reactors were being laid into the lead sarcophagus, while the crew of that Albatross secured the steel cabling and cargo hooks to it, and the link points on the Albatross itself. With the Kaiju's past scouring of radiation, Max had proposed using the fuel rods as bait. Worst case scenario, they'd at least prevent further radiological contamination. At best, they could lure the Kaiju away. With the Albatross's limited fuel supply, it was merely the delivery vector for their end goal, and he needed to make contact with them. "This is Max..." Allo 1, JN Shimakaze, do you read me? The Japanese Navy graciously donated one of their experimental prototypes for this task. Over the last 3 days, she had been systematically stripped of every non-essential gram of weight, just to make sure she could go as far as possible, as fast as possible. If she couldn't outrun the battle, it was their job to outfight it. The operator on the other end replied. Naturally, as he spoke Japanese, Maxis understood nothing of what was said. Only for Dr. Honda, who stood in as his translator, though she sounded out of breath. He said they are, but had to move her out of the bay in order to avoid any damage from the tremors. Almost at Reactor 3, their Geiger counters then started screaming, only to silence themselves a split second later. And then, it came. The most violent quake ripped through the area. Those cracks in the cooling towers now gave way. Chunks of concrete and steel breaking as thick, billowing clouds of steam erupted.
Get back!
The first time Maxis had ever heard Stevens raise his voice. Maxis refused to obey. Something, some primal force, whether fear, curiosity, or something more, kept him firmly rooted. Around him, the other cooling towers collapsed, and a great ear-splitting sound echoed around him. The sound of metal tearing, of the very earth breaking from the almighty force seeking freedom. Dust and steam mixing into a thick, obstructive cloud. But the behemoth of a shape couldn't be contained. First shadowed by the setting sun, making the dust look like a great flame around it, a set of gigantic jaws. Wide-eyed as he beheld this occasion, Maxis could even distinguish individual, massive teeth in the shape of the reactor itself, between those jaws. A massive curved horn atop its nose, the tip of it piercing the cloud, showing it was bone white. The screech of rending metal filled the air as its jaws clamped down, crushing what remained of the reactor, no doubt still containing the fuel rods they sought. Could it possibly be? Maxis thought.
Rico, get out of here!
Whoever called for that to the second albatross took off. Blake made sure it was sealed as the craft pulled away, but one of the larger soldiers dragged him away, ensuring he was out of the way of the metal coffin as it lifted off. I hope you're right about this, Maxis, Blake said dryly. An enormous black scaled hand, fingers tipped with the same bone-white color as the horn, emerged from the dust cloud. Missing the soldiers and Maxis, digging into the ground, the Kaiju before them pulled itself out of the ground, arching its back, revealing a row of curved spines. Next came one of its massive feet, crushing the remains of the cooling tower's base. Next came one of its massive feet, crushing some of the remains of one cooling tower's base. And finally, a long, similarly spine-covered tail made itself known. Max's jaws were open in awe as the great creature finally emerged. And the wind carried the dust away. Those black scales, those bone-white claws, spines, and horn. It was everything he'd hoped for, the spitting image of the creature from the legends of Oda's Island. The remaining scraps of the reactor fell from its jaws as it took in a great volume of air, to proclaim with a magnificent, bellowing roar its return. Now able to truly behold the splendor of a kaiju, so many years, so many dreams of this moment. The voice of such a creature, Maxis felt the sound slamming into his body, so the lingering dust in the air forced away from it. First, its gaze went to the albatross, carrying the nuclear fuel. Then its eyes swept the assembled crowd. Soldiers, tanks, kaijologists, all must have been insignificant before it. The name the ancients gave this creature, closing his eyes as he recalled it, that which echoed through their history. Gorgon. And yes, as you can tell, it does draw very heavily on, referencing to Godzilla and It's basically a love letter to a lot of old series that I love. Aliens, Transformers, Godzilla, obviously. And, half a dozen other things. Thank you guys for tuning in and, I guess, listening to this. I have absolutely no idea how to really make something like this, and I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, don't forget to subscribe for more, comment your thoughts below, and well, hopefully you guys did enjoy this. This was a part of the kaiju stories that I have been writing for some time, and truth be told, I've actually been really nervous about sharing these because I can re-listen to my own voice in editing for any of my regular videos, but for some reason when it comes to rereading my story writings and hearing my voice reading them, that bothers me. But who knows, maybe over time I'll get more used to that, and there is more to come if you guys enjoyed. Thank you all, and long live the Kaiju King.